Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlook here. So I wanted to make a video about an example of democratic backsliding. When we think about and learn about what a democracy is, examples of democracy, and then an example of democratic backsliding is probably useful to think about. We talked about some of the examples of some of the signs of democratic backsliding. So applying that to a case study is helpful for us to understand how this emerges. Again, democratic backsliding oftentimes doesn't occur in just a single swoop. It's not a coup, it's not a revolution. It is oftentimes through the slow breakdown of democratic norms. So when we think about an example, Hungary is one of the most frequently cited examples of democratic backsliding in contemporary political science. It is the example that many contemporary textbooks use. So let's spend some time thinking and talking about Hungary. Hungary's democracy didn't suddenly collapse. It didn't collapse overnight. It, like we talked about with democratic backsliding, Hungary's democracy slowly eroded legally and incrementally. Hungary shows us how a country can retain the outward form of democracy, still having elections, still having courts, still having a constitution, while hollowing out the democratic substance of what really makes a democracy, a consolidated democracy. So to understand how this has happened, let's take a step back and think about Hungary's democratic transition and then trace how the institutions have gradually been reshaped over time to better understand where Hungary is today and how it got here. So after the collapse of communism in 1989, Hungary was widely regarded as a success story for democratic transition. It adopted a new constitutional order, held competitive elections, developed a multi-party system, and integrated into Western political and economic institutions. In fact, Hungary joined NATO in 1999 and the European Union in 2004, signaling broad international confidence in its democratic credentials and institutions. For nearly 2 decades, Hungary experienced regular alternations in power between parties. It seemed like Hungary was going to be a success story for democracy. Democratic institutions themselves functioned reasonably well, even amid corruption scandals and economic challenges, which were not solely a Hungarian example. When we look at states of the former Soviet Union, corruption, economic challenges were a hallmark of the 90s and 2000s. So in this instance, Hungary seemed like a success story. It was a burgeoning and growing democracy. Yes, it had corruption, it had other issues that other states had, but it seemed like it was going to be a success. And importantly, democracy was not deeply contested during this period. Most political actors accepted the basic rules of the game of democracy. However, this period also left behind some vulnerabilities. Economic reforms created winners and losers, as we also saw in what we saw in post-Soviet states. Trust in political elites declined. Many citizens viewed post-communist democracy as corrupt, ineffective, and disconnected from ordinary people. These frustrations created fertile ground for political actors willing to challenge liberal democratic norms in the name of popular sovereignty. So if you're looking for deeper reading into Hungary, there's some good sources. One, for example, is Ben Rhodes. He wrote a book on authoritarianism, used Hungary as a case study, and he argued that this democratic decline, and he mapped out this democratic decline. So worth checking out. Okay, so back to Hungary itself. The 2010 um, was really a pivotal year for Hungary's democracy. In 2010, the conservative nationalist party Fidesz, led by Viktor Orban, won a sweeping electoral victory. Crucially, this was not just a normal majority. The party secured a two-thirds supermajority in parliament, giving it the constitutional authority to rewrite Hungary's basic political roles without needing opposition parties' approval. This moment is crucial for understanding democratic backsliding. The process did not begin with the rejection of elections or with democracy itself. It began with a democratic mandate that allowed the ruling party to fundamentally alter the institutional framework. Orban framed his victory and the victory as a historic moment, a chance to recreate the Hungarian state and correct what he portrayed as the failures of liberal democracy. This framing mattered because it justified extraordinary institutional changes as expressions as the will of the people because of the election results. So one of the first major steps taken by the Fidesz government was the replacement of Hungary's post-communist constitution. The new constitution was adopted through legal procedures, but without broad consultation or opposition participation. The Constitution instead redefined the balance of power in the political system. It weakened checks on the executive, altered the structure of oversight institutions, and embedded ideological commitments that would be difficult for future governments to reverse. This is a key backsliding strategy, locking in power beyond electoral cycles. Rather than eliminating democratic institutions, the new constitution reshaped them in ways that favored the ruling party and constrained future challengers. The judiciary became a central target in Hungary's backsliding process as well. Independent courts are essential for enforcing constitutional limits, protecting rights, and adjudicating disputes fairly. In Hungary, courts were not shut down or openly defined. Instead, they were gradually captured. The government lowered the mandatory retirement ages for judges, forcing many senior judges out of office. It reconstructed judicial oversight bodies and placed loyalists in key administrative positions. Appointment roles were changed to give the ruling party greater influence over judicial careers. The result was a judiciary that still existed and still issued rulings, but one that became increasingly cautious about challenging the government. This illustrates a broader pattern in democratic backsliding. Institutions lose independence before they lose existence. Hungary's media environment also changed dramatically, but again, not through outright censorship. The government the government gained influence over media agencies, or media regulatory agencies, which oversee licensing and content roles. State advertising was directed disproportionately toward pro-government outlets, while critical media organizations were excluded from this revenue stream. Business allies of the ruling party acquired major media companies, consolidating ownership in friendly hands. So over time, this produced a media ecosystem dominated by government aligned narratives, especially in television and radio, which reach broad audiences. Independent journalism did not disappear, but it became harder to sustain financially and reach mass audiences. For citizens, this meant a distorted information environment. Alternative views were still available, but they required more effort to find. This subtly shaped political debate without formally eliminating the for press freedom. Elections themselves continued to be held regularly, and the opposition parties continued to participate. However, electoral rolls were changed in ways that favored the ruling party. District boundaries were redrawn, campaign finance roles gave the incumbents advantages. Media bias affected campaign viability. Administrative resources were used in ways that blurred the lines between party and state. These changes did not eliminate competition, but they made competition unequal. Elections increasingly served to legitimize existing power rather than provide a genuine mechanism for alternatives. So this all underscores a crucial lesson for students. Democracy is not just about holding elections, but about whether elections are fair and meaningful. So civil society organizations, particularly those engaged in human rights, anti-corruption, or minority advocacy, faced growing pressure. NGOs receiving foreign funds were labeled as suspicious or agents of outside influence. New regulations increased reporting requirements and administrative burdens. Protest remained legal, but policing became more assertive and public spaces more regulated. This effect was not total repression, but a steady increase in the costs of dissent. Over time, fewer citizens were willing to take political risks. Activism became more professionalized and less mass, just movement based. This quiet demobilization is a hallmark of successful democratic backsliding. And perhaps the most important element of Hungary's backsliding is how it was politically justified. Orban framed his project as a rejection of, quote, liberal democracy in favor of what he called an, quote, illiberal state. He argued that strong leadership, national sovereignty, and cultural cohesion were more important than institutional constraints imposed by courts, media, or international organizations. This message resonated with many voters, particularly in a context of economic insecurity, migration fears, and distrust of political elites. Democratic backsliding was not imposed against public opinion, it was often enabled by it. This highlights a crucial role in a critical point. That democratic backsliding often succeeds not because citizens reject democracy entirely, but because they prioritize other values, order, identity, stability, over democratic constraints or democratic norms. So for most citizens, democratic backsliding in Hungary did not immediately feel dramatic. People could still vote, travel, work, and express opinions. But over time, political life became more polarized more polarized and less open. Journalists self-censored, opposition supporters felt marginalized, citizens increasingly believed that political outcomes were predetermined. Trust in institutions declined, not because institutions disappeared, but because they no longer felt neutral or fair. Hungary today is commonly described as a hybrid regime, a system that combines democratic procedures with authoritarian practices. It is no longer considered a consolidated democracy, but it is not an authoritarian regime. And this is why our textbook highlights this middle ground. So we have consolidated democracies and then authoritarian regimes, and then many things in the middle along the spectrum. So when we think of why textbooks look at Hungary, Hungary matters because it shows us that democracy does not always collapse through violence or through a coup. It can erode through role changes, institutional capture, and popular rhetoric, all while maintaining formal democratic procedures. The Hungarian case forces us to confront a bit of an uncomfortable truth that democracy depends not only on institutions or on a constitution, but on a shared commitment to limits on power. When that commitment weakens among elites and citizens alike, democracy can move backwards, one legal change at a time. So this is why Hungary has become such a central case for the study of democratic backsliding, why authors like Ben Rhodes write about it and other authors who look at the world holistically. Hungary teaches us democracy can be hollowed out from within, and why defending democracy requires more than simply holding elections. So when we think about what is democracy, it is far more than simply just holding elections every couple of years. Thank you.